Hi everyone, it's Lauren. I hope you're all doing really well. Today I wanted to list through my favourite non-fiction books. I really enjoy reading non-fiction, and actually I am more likely to listen to a non-fiction book than read it, just because I really enjoy that in an audiobook. I'm used to listening to podcasts, so non-fiction seems to go into my brain quite easily in audio form. And I'm also including biographies and autobiographies in this list as well. So as always, I would love to hear from you what your favourite non-fiction books are. Please give me your recommendations in the comments below. These are in no particular order and span a multitude of topics. So let's get started. The first one I have today is Losing Earth, The Decade in Which We Could Have Stopped Climate Change by Nathaniel. I listened to this on audiobook and I don't know that I'd recommend it because it was actually quite terrifying, and having something scary in your ears just feels quite intimate, and I'm not sure I liked it. I wish I had read it in printed form instead, but this is a fascinating look at human inaction and the fact that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we knew everything about climate change that we know today. There's not been any new information in that time, and essentially people just couldn't see how urgent it was. People couldn't see how pressing it was. They realised they would lose, it just cost too much money. They would lose too much money to change their habits. And it's so frustrating to look back at the scientists, the politicians who were involved at this time, who were so close to making a policy change that would have helped climate change. And they just didn't. So it's just about that time, about people realising the trajectory that we're on, trying to change something and not. It's reasonably even-handed, I think. You get lots of different backstories from different people. And it really reminded me of, if you have seen the movie The Big Short, which is about the financial crisis. That's what this book feels like. I really think it should be made into a film. It would be fascinating and frustrating and excruciating all at the same time. Next we have TheFive by Hallie Rubenhold, which is about the lives of the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper in London in the 19th century. And I think what Hallie Rubenhold does absolutely expertly here is balance the personal with the wider context of Victorian London at that time, the context of the amount of homeless people that were on the streets during that time, what the policy was towards people who lived on the street, the concept of what a fallen woman really was, and the fact that their definition of what a prostitute was very different to our definition. And she really doesn't dwell on these women's murders, which has been talked about enough. She doesn't dwell on their murderer or who he might be at all. This is just giving them back their stories. She gives us a complete biography, as much as she possibly can, of each of the 5 women. And for at least 3 of them, I think, there's no evidence that they ever engaged in sex work at all. And although you know the ending of these women's stories, it's so upsetting and frustrating. You're really rooting for them. You want them to make different and better choices so they don't end up on the streets. And it's so well researched. It astounded me how much evidence, how much information there is about all of these women. And yet we never really hear about them. We only hear all the conspiracy theories about who Jack the Ripper was. So I would highly, highly recommend this. Next we have Natives by Akala. This is part autobiography on Akala's part, as growing up as a mixed race boy in London during the 80s, and also kind of a look at Britain's relationship with race and colonialism and empire in a way that's really confronting, that's really eye-opening. I love the mix of his personal touch, of his experience growing up, what it was like for him to be living with his white mother, and how much she made sure that her children had their education as part of the African diaspora. It's a fantastic look at the intersection between race and cultural issues within Britain specifically. And another book which deals with similar issues but in a much more historical format is Black and British by David Olusoga. This is an exceptional history book which is bringing back voices throughout the centuries of Black Britons, right from Roman times right up until the modern day, modern history, up until about Windrush generation is where we stop. There is, of course, a really strong look at slavery and Britain's involvement in that, but it's a much wider look at Britain's relationship with Black people, with the people who are Black, who were born and raised here, people who emigrated here, who were brought here as slaves, and about our relationship with Africa, with the African continent and the mysteries of Africa, specifically with countries like Sierra Leone and the transatlantic slave trade. And it's really great at balancing the wider context of these time periods, because a lot of history is being covered in this one book, and really seeing it from the personal level. And I think it paints a really vivid picture of these people, what their lives were like, how they related to each other, how different Britons at different points in history had very different opinions on race and racial issues and cultural issues and ideas of black and white. And it felt very comprehensive. Highly recommend it. Inside This Place Not of It is one of the most harrowing books that I've read this year, and these are tales from inside women's prison in the US prison system. They're either stories from women who have been incarcerated, and in some cases they're from women who are still inside, and it just looks at what their situation was, how they ended up in the prison system, and then what it was like for them once they got in. The institutional sexism and racism and sexual abuse is of course rife, as is just general bullying and abuse of power. And I think what really hit me was just how powerless some of these women were. Some of them didn't even have very serious crimes to their name. Some of them were just accessories to crimes and ended up with such extreme sentences and such a loss of power, of agency. And often they were denied basic human rights, such as medical aid, or if they tried to complain against their treatment, there was a big backlash culture. Some of them were kept from, going to parole hearings and things like that by their guards. And yeah, it's eye-opening and very distressing, but very necessary. The Cutout Girl by Bart Van Es is part biography, part autobiography, and it's very interesting the way it's written. This is about Bart Van Es's own family, but it focuses on a young woman at the time, Lien, who was a Jewish girl living in the Netherlands, who got taken in by Bart Van Es's family and during the war. And although he knew that she lived with them and she was a very important part of their lives, they actually ended up almost adopting her after the war. She then fell out with them at some point and was never mentioned again. And he found that very fascinating. He reaches out to Lien, and this is a mix of telling her story and also the story of him contacting her and going to the Netherlands, visiting some of the places that she stayed in, and it's so beautifully and carefully managed, like the link between Lien and what her memories actually are, and which in some cases are quite sparse, and the information that Bart Van Es manages to learn or glean about the situation from wider history, and he puts two and two together. He'll often mention things like, the chapter that you have just written, Lien has read back and she's actually not very happy with it because she thinks I've made it too vivid, and he's so self-aware, but it works brilliantly. And he's never overwhelmed or blinded by his personal connection to the situation, which I think is admirable. He keeps a very objective view as much as he can on people's differing memories and different opinions on the past, but also you can tell he cares so much about it because of this personal connection. And yeah, it's a completely beautiful read. Girls Will Be Girls by Emer O'Toole is one of those books that I recommend to a lot of people, but it's also something that I read quite a while ago now, and I almost feel like I need to reread it just to make sure it's still on point and I still agree with it. But this was one of the first books, non-fiction books, that I read on feminism, but not just feminism, more so like gender, and it really blew me away at the time. It brought to life for me so many of the things that we do in order to perform our own genders, how much of gender is a presentation and is societal about what's expected of women and what's expected of men, and I really love how she broke that down, and I found it so readable as well at the time. So I think it's a book that I would definitely recommend if you're newish to this sort of reading on gender, on feminism, on sexism, whatever it is, and you've not really read anything on that academic side before. I think this is a great way into some of these concepts. This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay is a book that in the UK at least has been absolutely everywhere because it's about the diaries of an NHS junior doctor. Adam Kay was a junior doctor for many, many years. He got to the point where he was just about to become consultant and decided to leave the profession. And these are stories taken from the diaries that he had to keep as part of his training. And it is just fascinating and upsetting and eye-opening, and it makes you appreciate the NHS so much, and I think it should be required reading. Everyone should read it. He works in Obs and Gynae, and some of the stories are very upsetting, some of the stories are very hilarious, especially when he's talking about do many things that people put up their bottoms. And it just makes you appreciate how hard doctors and nurses work and how difficult their situation is, but also the many joys and eccentricities of the great British public. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalinithi is another medical adjacent book. This is extremely lyrical, extremely beautiful and very sad. Paul Kalinithi was a brain surgeon who was then diagnosed with lung cancer at a very young age, and this is his own story of his diagnosis, of his life really, leading up to that point. And it's such a poignant look at what life is, what life means. Like, he has been on the forefront of life and death in his career, and then it's about his transition from doctor to patient and what that was like for him. And incredibly, for somebody who spent their entire career as a doctor, it's beautifully written. It is of course going to tug on your heartstrings, and you have to be in the mood to read something like that, but I think it's very much worth the effort. Lowborn by Kerry Hudson is another one of those books which I think should be required reading, in the UK at least. This is Kerry Hudson's, I suppose, autobiography, but more specifically looking at her childhood, growing up extremely poor, going from council house to council house, what that was like for her. And then she is revisiting some of these places as an adult to see what they're like now. So it's half autobiography, half social commentary. And what she conveys so well is the cycle of poverty and how difficult it is to get out of that. Her mother was in unstable relationships a lot, and it just really shows how difficult it was for Kerry to get out of that and get to a point where she could be successful and get to a safe place in her life, because the state wasn't really there to support them. They were moving around a lot, and the estates and the houses and the flats that they ended up in weren't kept very well, and they're in very poor parts of the country where there's nothing really for the people around there, no jobs. And it's very interesting to see her confront her own childhood and a lot of trauma really that happened, that perhaps she'd never really thought about properly before. And each of these visits she goes to these different towns, like in Great Yarmouth, for example, is almost like, I guess, an exorcism, or like a confrontation of what things happened at that point in her life when she was living there, and just to see what it's like now, and to see whether life has improved for anybody who lives in those places, in which in many cases hasn't improved at all. The Gender Games by Juno Dawson is one of those books which seems very easy to read, very readable, very fun, almost quite lightweight, which really hides how skillful it is, because she's talking about her life as a trans woman, growing up thinking she was a gay man for a long time, and kind of her coming to grips with her gender and who she is, her own identity. But it's also just looking at gender more generally. The tagline for this book is "The Trouble with Men and Women by Someone Who Has Been Both." And I think that's a really great way to position this book. Like, it's just a look at gender in general. It's about her growing up during the 90s in the UK. If you like the Spice Girls, there will be many references to them. And it's really fun. And I have read some other books which are in this kind of semi-autobiographical, looking at, culture and other wider issues at the same time. And I've seen it not done very well. And that makes you appreciate when it is done very well, which it is in this book. And finally, we have another autobiography, which is Educated by Tara Westover. This is a fascinating book about Tara's life growing up in not quite a cult, but a very overtly religious family who were off-grid. They didn't trust the government at all. She was homeschooled, and they didn't believe in modern medicine, modern society, basically. But she managed to school herself enough to get to college. And this is really a look back at her own life, her own childhood, her family situation, but also her then realising how different, how unnormal her family actually were, and learning some other things about society when she went to college, and her kind of confronting some of those things that happened in her childhood. It's absolutely fascinating. It's very frustrating, especially when there are points when the children might be in very dangerous situations. They may have been injured quite badly doing some work on their farm, and their father's just like, oh well, because he won't take them to a hospital, and they're just like, oh well, God will heal you. She just can't believe that this kind of thing happens. And it's also really interesting seeing her confront her own past. In a similar vein to some of the other books I've mentioned in this video, she's very careful about her own past and saying, my memories of this event are XYZ. They, however, differ to my brother's memories, who thinks this happened. And she's like, both are equally true. That's what we have. We have no objective person to tell us who's right and who's wrong. And she does kind of treat her family with as much love and care as she can, and she tries to be as objective as she can and give both sides, which I think is, you know, whether she achieves it or not, is an admirable thing to attempt to do. So I hope there are at least some books there that you hadn't heard of before, perhaps some that I've encouraged you to give a go. As I said at the beginning of the video, I would love to hear your recommendations for your favourite non-fiction books. I think it's great to get into the habit of reading non-fiction alongside fiction. It mixes up your reading and we also get to learn something along the way. So I will look forward to having a chat with you all in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!